Richard Calloway was a man who had everything: wealth, power, and a name respected in the business world. But something always bothered him. He had heard countless stories of how banks treated people differently based on their looks, status, or financial condition. He wanted to know if those stories were true. Were banks really that cold and unfair to the less fortunate? He had a simple plan to find out. One evening, Richard stood in front of the mirror in his grand mansion. He barely recognized himself after he was done with his disguise. His usual sharp suit was gone. Instead, he wore old, tattered clothes he had bought from a thrift shop. He rubbed dirt on his face, let his hair grow wild, and didn't shave for days. He looked nothing like the billionaire people knew. To the world, he was now just another homeless man, invisible and ignored. With only a few crumpled dollars in his pocket, Richard stepped onto the cold streets of the city. He had never felt this way before. People walking past him without a second glance, cars honking as if he was in their way. He had always been on the other side, the one people respected, the one banks welcomed with smiles. But tonight, he was just another man struggling to get by. His first stop was a well-known bank, a place that had handled some of his biggest business transactions. He walked in, feeling the eyes of the staff on him the moment he stepped through the door. He approached the counter, clutching the few dollars he had. The teller barely looked at him before turning away, as if he wasn't even there. Richard cleared his throat and politely asked, "Excuse me, ma'am. I'd like to open an account." The woman behind the counter raised an eyebrow and sighed. She looked him up and down, clearly judging his appearance. "Do you even have enough money to start one?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. Richard nodded and showed her the cash. "It's not much, but I want to save whatever I can." She let out a small laugh and shook her head. "We have a minimum balance requirement. You might want to try somewhere else," she said, her voice cold and dismissive. Before Richard could say anything else, a security guard appeared beside him. "Sir, I think you should leave," the guard said firmly, already reaching for his arm. Richard felt something deep inside him shift. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed. They hadn't even given him a chance. They didn't see him as a person, just a problem to remove. Without arguing, he turned and walked out. The moment he stepped back onto the street, he felt the sting of reality. This was how many people were treated every day. But his test had just begun. He wasn't done yet. He would try another bank, and this time, he would see if anyone treated him with the kindness every human deserved. Richard walked down the busy street, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. The cold breeze brushed against his face, and he felt the weight of his disguise even more. He had just been thrown out of the first bank, but he wasn't ready to give up. He had to see if all banks treated people this way, or if there was at least one that would show kindness. After walking for a few blocks, he spotted another bank. This one looked even more expensive than the last. Tall glass windows reflected the golden lights of the city, and the name of the bank was proudly displayed in silver letters above the entrance. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The moment he entered, the warmth of the bank hit him, but so did the stairs. People in fancy suits stood in line, chatting with the tellers, while others sat in plush chairs, waiting for their appointments. But all of them had one thing in common. They looked like they belonged. Richard, on the other hand, did not. He walked up to the counter and waited for his turn. The teller, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, barely glanced at him. When Richard finally stepped forward, the man sighed, as if he was already tired of the conversation before it even began. "I'd like to open an account," Richard said, keeping his voice steady. The teller frowned, his eyes scanning Richard's shabby clothes. "Do you have an ID?" he asked, his tone sharp. Richard nodded and pulled out a worn-out wallet. Inside was his ID, but he made sure it looked as basic as possible. No signs of his billionaire status. The teller took it and sighed again, this time more dramatically. "You need a minimum deposit of $500 to open an account here," he said, tapping his fingers on the counter. Richard shook his head. I don't have that much right now, but I want to start small and save little by little. The teller smirked, a look of amusement flashing across his face. This isn't that kind of bank. Maybe try a community bank or a credit union. Richard felt a mix of emotions. He wasn't expecting special treatment, but he had hoped for at least a little respect. Before he could respond, another bank employee walked past, whispering something to the teller. They both exchanged glances, and then, without another word, the teller called over security. A tall guard in a navy uniform walked up to Richard. "Sir, I think it's best if you leave," he said, his voice polite but firm. Richard stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Without saying another word, he turned and walked out. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he let out a deep breath. 2 banks, 2 rejections. He knew now that the stories about unfair treatment were true. But he wasn't done. He would try again. He had to find out if there was still a place where a person was treated with dignity, no matter how they looked. Richard's disappointment grew with each step as he wandered through the busy streets. The rejection from the second bank weighed on him, but he wasn't about to give up. He had come this far to test the integrity of these institutions, and he would see it through. After walking for a few more blocks, he spotted a smaller bank tucked away on a quiet corner. It didn't have the flashy signs or gleaming glass windows like the others, but something about it felt different, more humble, more community-focused. With a sigh, Richard decided to give it a try. The doorbell chimed as he entered, and the warm, inviting atmosphere immediately felt different from the cold, corporate feeling of the previous banks. Inside, the space was cozy with soft lighting, and the staff, though still busy, seemed to pay more attention to the customers. Richard felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this place would treat him with more respect. He walked up to the counter and waited. The teller, a young woman with a friendly smile and bright eyes, looked up and met his gaze. She didn't seem to notice his unkempt appearance right away. Instead, she greeted him warmly. "Hi there. How can I help you today?" she asked, her voice kind and genuine. Richard hesitated for a moment. This was different. She hadn't immediately looked him up and down with judgment, nor had she dismissed him outright. He decided to push forward with his plan. "I'd like to open an account," he said quietly, hoping his voice wouldn't betray the tension he felt. The teller smiled again. "Of course. What kind of account are you looking for? We have a variety of options depending on your needs." Richard was taken aback by her willingness to engage. Most tellers he'd encountered so far had barely given him the time of day. But this woman was treating him as if he were any other customer. "Well, I don't have much to start with," he admitted, pulling out his small wad of cash. "Just a little bit to get started." The teller nodded, showing no sign of judgment. "That's okay. We have a few accounts that are perfect for someone just starting out. You don't need to have a large deposit." Richard felt a warmth in his chest. She wasn't treating him as if he were invisible or unworthy. She was actually taking the time to help him, to listen to him. It was a stark contrast to the coldness he had experienced at the other banks. "I don't have much to my name," Richard continued, looking down at the crumpled bills in his hand. "But I just want to save whatever I can." The teller didn't flinch or give him a pitying look. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering a little to make their conversation more personal. "I understand. We all start somewhere, and every little bit counts." Richard was amazed at how kind and patient she was. She didn't rush him or treat him like a problem to be solved. She actually made him feel like he mattered, like his goals were important, even if they were modest. After a few more questions and a quick check of the minimal paperwork, she set up an account for him. One that didn't require a hefty initial deposit. She handed him the paperwork with a smile and said, "You'll receive your account information in the mail shortly. And if you need help with anything, feel free to stop by any time." As Richard left the bank, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope he hadn't felt all day. This small community bank, with its simple values and caring staff, had proven to be a place where a person was treated with dignity, no matter their appearance or financial status. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he hadn't just been tested, he had been seen. The next day, Richard couldn't shake the feeling of satisfaction from his visit to the small community bank. It had been a surprisingly pleasant experience, but he knew he couldn't stop there. As he reflected on the different ways people had treated him in the past few days, a part of him felt the need to push the experiment even further. Could it be that kindness was truly rare in the world of big business, or was it just a matter of finding the right place? This time, Richard decided to step things up. He wanted to see how far the banks would go to deny him. So he chose a different approach. He made his way to another well-known institution, one that prided itself on its prestigious status and reputation. The building was massive, towering above the surrounding structures, and its modern architecture reflected the image of wealth and exclusivity. As Richard walked in, the polished marble floors gleamed under the bright lights, and the interior looked far more luxurious than the community bank. The atmosphere was quiet but busy, with employees walking briskly between desks and customers talking in hushed tones. He took a deep breath and walked confidently up to the counter, determined to see if they would treat him any differently than the last two places. The teller, a young man in a sharp suit, looked at him with a slight frown, but didn't immediately dismiss him. Richard felt a small flicker of hope that maybe this bank would prove different. "I'd like to open an account," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. The teller paused, raising an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" he asked, his tone a little colder than Richard had expected. Richard shook his head. "No, I don't have one. But I would like to speak to someone about opening a basic account." The teller gave a small nod but didn't seem entirely convinced. He took a moment to glance at Richard's clothes before typing something into his computer. After a brief pause, he looked back up, his expression distant. "I'm afraid we require a minimum balance of $500 to open an account here," he said, his voice flat. "Perhaps you should try elsewhere." Richard's heart sank. This wasn't the first time he had heard those words, but somehow it still stung. The first two banks had turned him away quickly, but this one felt different. It was as though they didn't even consider him worthy of a chance. He tried to push forward. "I only have a few dollars, but I'd still like to speak to someone about what options I might have." The teller barely looked up as he pressed a button to call for security. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't think you understand. This is a high-end institution. You're better off going somewhere more suited to your needs." Before Richard could respond, a security guard appeared, standing silently beside him. The guard didn't say anything, but the message was clear. It was time for him to leave. Richard stood there for a moment, staring at the teller, trying to make sense of the situation. It wasn't just the coldness of their words. It was the fact that no one had even tried to understand. He wasn't looking for special treatment, but he couldn't help but feel like he was being cast aside just because he didn't fit their ideal customer. With a resigned sigh, Richard turned to leave. As he walked out of the building, he realized how much this experience had opened his eyes. This was more than just an experiment. It was a harsh reminder of the world's inequality. But even in the face of rejection, Richard wasn't ready to give up. He had already seen that a little kindness went a long way, and now he was more determined than ever to find a place where people were treated as equals, no matter their appearance or status. The day after his visit to the high-end bank, Richard couldn't help but feel conflicted. The rejection from the last bank had left him feeling disheartened, but it had also ignited a deeper sense of determination. He was determined to find the answer to his original question. How do banks treat people who don't fit their image of a worthy customer? What would happen if he revealed his true identity? Richard had already been to 3 banks, and while one had treated him with kindness, the others had dismissed him without a second thought. He realized that he wasn't just testing the banks anymore. He was testing the world around him. This experiment had become something more personal. It was time for him to take the next step. Richard decided to return to each of the banks, but this time, he would do something different. Instead of walking in disguised as a homeless man, he would return in his true billionaire persona, dressed in his finest suit, with the confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was. He would walk into those same banks, not as the man they had rejected, but as the man they would have eagerly welcomed. And he was going to see how they would react when they found out who they had turned away. The next morning, Richard carefully selected a sharp-tailored suit, complete with a silk tie and polished shoes. He looked every bit the wealthy businessman he was. He had planned this moment carefully, knowing that when he revealed his identity, the shock would be undeniable. He needed to be sure that he would make a lasting impression. He first visited the community bank, the one where he had been treated with warmth and respect. He walked in confidently, feeling the eyes of the staff turn toward him as he entered. The same young teller, Emma, was working at the counter. As soon as she saw him, her face lit up with recognition. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" she asked, smiling warmly. Richard smiled back, but his words caught her off guard. "You may not recognize me, but we met a few days ago. I was here before, but I was dressed a little differently." Emma's brow furrowed slightly in confusion, but before she could say anything, Richard removed his sunglasses and loosened his tie. Her eyes widened in surprise as she realized who he was. "Wait, you're—" she started, unable to finish the sentence. Richard nodded. "Yes, I'm Richard Calloway, the billionaire businessman who came in dressed as a homeless man. I wanted to see how I would be treated." Emma's face turned pale, and she immediately looked embarrassed, her eyes darting around. "Oh my goodness, I had no idea. I swear, I wasn't judging you. I was just trying to be helpful." Richard held up a hand, signaling her to calm down. "I know. I saw your kindness, and that's why I'm here now. I wanted to thank you." She blinked, clearly surprised. "You're thanking me, but I thought you were here too." Richard interrupted her with a reassuring smile. "No, I'm thanking you for treating me with respect, regardless of my appearance. You did something many others wouldn't have done, and for that, you deserve to be recognized." Emma's shock began to fade, and she let out a soft sigh of relief. "I never expected this, but thank you. I'm glad I was able to help." Richard smiled. "You did more than help. You reminded me that kindness still exists, and that's why I'm here today." As he turned to leave, he made sure to mention that he had decided to make a large donation to the bank to support its efforts to help people in need. The donation would ensure that more customers would receive the same warmth and attention Emma had shown him. Before he left, Richard took a moment to reflect. This visit, this moment, had shown him something important. There were still good people in the world, and it wasn't all about the wealth or appearance. Emma's reaction proved that there was hope for humanity, even in places where people often felt forgotten. Richard wasn't done yet. There was still more to see, more to discover. But this first step, the one that had started as a test, had already shown him that integrity and kindness weren't entirely lost, and that was something worth holding on to. Richard left the community bank with a sense of satisfaction, his heart a little lighter than it had been in days. Emma's kindness had shown him that not all banks, or people for that matter, were driven by the coldness of profit or appearance. But there was still more to be done, more to learn. He hadn't yet visited the two larger banks where he'd faced rejection, and he knew he couldn't stop until he'd seen how they would respond to the truth about who he was. The next day, Richard dressed once again in his best suit. The luxury of his tailored clothing was a sharp contrast to the worn-out clothes he had worn days earlier. As he entered the first of the larger banks, he was met with the usual polished exterior, sleek marble floors, quiet but efficient employees, and the buzz of professional conversations around him. He felt a slight sense of unease, but he pushed it aside. It was time for the second phase of his experiment. He approached the same teller who had dismissed him previously. The young man, who had looked at Richard with disdain before, barely glanced at him when he approached the counter. But today, Richard wasn't just another customer. This time, he was someone who had the power to expose the behavior that had left him feeling dehumanized days earlier. "I'm here to speak with someone about opening an account," Richard said calmly, his voice steady and confident. The teller looked at him for a moment, his eyes briefly flicking to Richard's suit, then back to the computer screen. "I see," the teller said, his tone now polite but distant. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Richard replied, maintaining eye contact. "But I'm sure I'll be able to speak with someone anyway." The teller raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but he did nothing to stop him. Instead, he motioned for Richard to wait for a moment. As Richard waited, he felt the buzz of conversation in the background, the quiet hum of staff moving about, each seemingly in their own world. Finally, after a few minutes, a manager walked up, his demeanor professional but not welcoming. "Yes, how can I help you?" the manager asked. Richard didn't waste time. "I'm Richard Calloway. I was here a few days ago in disguise. I came in dressed as a homeless man to see how I would be treated. You probably don't remember me, but I was rejected, just like the others." The manager's expression shifted in an instant, surprise, then confusion, then a moment of guilt. "Excuse me?" the manager asked, his voice shaky now. Richard leaned in slightly, his presence commanding. "You didn't want to open an account for me because I didn't have enough money, and I didn't look the part. I was treated like I didn't belong here, and security was called to escort me out." The manager paused, clearly trying to process this information. His gaze flickered to the teller, who was now standing behind him, looking uncomfortable. I wasn't aware of the situation," the manager said finally, his voice tight. Richard nodded. "I know, but now you are." I deeply apologize for that," the manager stammered, his face flushing with embarrassment. "We have certain policies, but I never would have expected such treatment. Please, allow me to make it right." Richard, who had expected some form of excuse or denial, found himself surprised by the manager's genuine apology. It wasn't perfect, but it was an acknowledgement. He had hoped for an answer like this from the beginning, someone who would admit their mistakes and strive to fix them. Richard didn't want to leave the situation on a sour note. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I wanted to see if I could change the way this bank does things. I believe it's important to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their appearance or financial standing." The manager nodded, his expression more serious now. "You're absolutely right. I'll make sure we review our policies, and I'll personally ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. Thank you for bringing it to my attention." Richard smiled slightly, feeling the weight of the situation lift a little. "Good. I'm glad you understand." As he walked out of the bank, Richard couldn't help but feel like this visit had made a difference. The manager hadn't tried to deflect or justify the treatment he had received. Instead, he had owned up to it and promised to make changes. For the first time in his experiment, Richard felt like his actions had an impact. He had set out to see how people would react when faced with the truth about their behavior, and this was a step in the right direction. But there was still one more place to visit, the last bank, where the staff had been dismissive and quick to call security. Richard couldn't wait to see how they would respond now that they knew who he was. Would they apologize as the last bank had? Or would they continue to hide behind their policies? Richard was about to find out. The final bank was the one that had left Richard feeling the most disillusioned. The cold reception and quick dismissal were still fresh in his mind. He had been treated like an inconvenience rather than a potential customer. But now, with the knowledge of who he really was, he was determined to see how they would respond. This was the last step in his experiment. He had already seen the differences in the way people treated him when he was in his disguise, but how would they react when they realized they had treated the wrong person so poorly? Richard walked through the doors of the bank with purpose. The staff behind the counters glanced up, and the usual professional atmosphere seemed unchanged. But Richard wasn't just another customer now. He was someone who had experienced firsthand how cold and judgmental these institutions could be. He approached the same teller who had turned him away during his first visit. This time, he wore a confident expression, and his sharp suit stood in stark contrast to the ragged clothes he had worn before. The teller looked at him for a moment, unsure of what to make of his sudden change in appearance. "Hello," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Richard Calloway. I was here a few days ago, dressed as a homeless man, and I was treated like I didn't matter. I was told to leave and not even given a chance." The teller's face shifted slightly, a look of recognition dawning on him. He had seen Richard before, but the transformation was so complete that he clearly hadn't made the connection. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't remember," the teller began, his voice trailing off as he realized who Richard was. Richard didn't wait for him to finish. "You don't have to apologize. I'm here to understand why I was treated the way I was. I was polite. I asked about opening an account, and yet I was treated like an outsider, just because I didn't look the part." The teller's discomfort was evident. He shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, his fingers tapping nervously on the surface. I'm sorry you felt that way, sir. I wasn't part of that interaction, but I'll make sure to let my manager know." Richard nodded. He didn't want the teller to feel personally attacked. The problem wasn't with the employees themselves, but with a larger issue of judgment based on appearance. "I understand," Richard replied. "But you need to understand that when someone is dismissed because they don't meet certain expectations, it reflects badly on the entire institution. People aren't just customers. They're human beings who deserve respect." As the teller processed this, a manager came over, having noticed the conversation. He was a man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that screamed authority. He approached Richard with a neutral expression, but there was a noticeable tension in his posture. "What's the problem here?" the manager asked, his voice businesslike. Richard didn't hesitate. "I'm Richard Calloway, and I was here a few days ago. I was treated poorly by your staff. No one offered me assistance or even tried to understand why I was there. I was made to feel like an inconvenience." The manager's expression hardened, and for a moment, Richard saw a flicker of annoyance before the man regained his composure. "Sir, we have protocols to follow. We don't open accounts without proper documentation or a minimum deposit." Richard shook his head slightly. "I know, but I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was just trying to find out if the way I was treated was a reflection of your institution's values. And I can tell you, from my experience, it wasn't." The manager paused, clearly uneasy. "I see. And you were dressed in different clothing when you came in?" Richard smiled wryly. "Yes, I was testing how I would be treated. And now, I'm testing how you react when you realize I'm the person you turned away." The manager's face softened, and he took a moment to compose himself. "I apologize for the way you were treated. I can assure you that our bank values all customers, no matter their appearance or financial situation. I will look into this matter and ensure it doesn't happen again." Richard nodded. "I appreciate that, but actions speak louder than words. It's not enough to just apologize. It's important to make real changes to ensure that no one else feels the way I did." The manager seemed to understand, and after a few moments of silence, he extended his hand. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll work to improve our approach. I'll personally oversee this matter." Richard shook the manager's hand firmly. "I hope you do. Everyone deserves respect, and it's up to businesses like yours to lead by example." After the experience at the last bank, Richard's thoughts were a whirlwind. He had walked into the heart of a world that so often dismissed people based on their outward appearances, and though he had seen some positive changes, it was clear that there was still a long way to go. But despite all the challenges, something inside him had shifted. The test he had set out to complete had ended up teaching him just as much about himself as it did about the institutions he was trying to understand. He reflected on the moments that had struck him the hardest, the indifference he had faced, the casual dismissal, and the pain of being invisible. But he also thought about the kindness he had found. Emma at the community bank, the manager who had listened to him, the acknowledgement of his experience. It all proved that there was still hope in the world. There were places and people who saw beyond the surface, who were willing to make a difference. As Richard stood on the sidewalk outside the last bank, he made a decision. He was going to take action. He couldn't change the world overnight, but he could make sure that the small act of kindness he had experienced didn't go unnoticed. He wanted to give back. He wanted to show that every person mattered, regardless of how they looked or what they could offer. He decided to start with the community bank where Emma had helped him. Richard knew that they had been a beacon of kindness in a world that often seemed too cold. He walked into the bank the next day, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He was going to help them continue their mission, helping those who needed it most. The moment he walked through the door, Emma saw him and smiled, recognizing him immediately. "Mr. Calloway, it's good to see you again," she said warmly, standing up from her desk. Richard returned the smile. "Please call me Richard. I wanted to talk to you and your manager. I've been thinking about what happened, and I've come to a decision." Emma's curiosity piqued as she led him to the back office. Richard could see the other staff members glancing over, still shocked at the idea that someone with so much wealth was standing in their midst. When they sat down, Richard explained, "I've decided to make a donation to your bank, one that will allow you to help even more people, to provide resources and services for those who need them most. I've seen firsthand how important it is for a bank to be a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of their background." Emma's eyes widened, and she shook her head in disbelief. I don't know what to say. This is incredible, but why?" Richard smiled softly. "Because you showed me what kindness really looks like. I want to make sure that people like you have the resources to do even more good." He made sure that the donation would help the bank expand its outreach programs and ensure that they could offer more affordable services to the community. The goal was clear: to create a more inclusive and supportive environment for everyone, no matter where they came from. As Richard left the bank that day, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had seen both the worst and the best of the world. He had walked in the shoes of those who were often overlooked and dismissed, and now he was making sure that no one would be left behind. The small act of kindness he had experienced from Emma and the team had sparked something larger than he had anticipated. This experience had changed him. It had shown him that the world could be better. That change could come from even the most unexpected places. And as he walked away, Richard felt more certain than ever that the world didn't need to be divided by wealth, status, or appearance. All it needed was a little more understanding, a little more kindness, and a lot more people willing to do the right thing. He had tested the system, and while it wasn't perfect, he had learned a powerful lesson. Sometimes it only takes one person to make a difference, and from that day forward, Richard would do everything he could to be that person, to make sure that no one ever felt invisible again.